Thank you all for joining. Good evening, and welcome to our second Jumpstart Wilmington Kickstart Session. I'm Deanna Sargent, and I'm Vice President of Community Development at Cinnaire, and we appreciate you joining us for this evening. As a friendly reminder, please make sure to mute your phone or listening device unless speaking. Next slide, please. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Jumpstart Wilmington program, it is modeled after Jumpstart Germantown, which launched in Philadelphia 5 years ago. Wilmington is the first city to launch a Jumpstart program outside of Philadelphia. The purpose of the program is to promote the growth of local developer capacity through training and development to support neighborhood revitalization and community development solutions by providing aspiring developers with the skills, knowledge, and support they need to rehabilitate properties. Jumpstart Wilmington was launched by Cinnaire to increase local developer capacity in Wilmington and stimulate neighborhood revitalization in neighborhood communities. The program consists of three main components, which are 12 to 15 hours of development training, mentoring, and networking. Those interested in participating in the program can apply during our upcoming application round, which will open on March 29th. A complementary component of Jumpstart Wilmington is our Kickstart Sessions, which will be focused on specific development topics and will be open to the broader development community. We will also like to acknowledge the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration Center for Community Research and Service, who assists with program administration. I'd now like to introduce our speaker of the evening, Rob Snowberger. Rob is the developer and owner of 9th Street Development Company and comes from an extensive real estate development background with a focus in acquisition, development, and financing. He holds an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and a BA from George Washington University. He was formerly the Vice President of Development for the Buccini Polling Group, overseeing over $200 million worth of real estate development projects in Wilmington, Delaware. Rob is also a combat veteran, having served 6 years as a Navy SEAL. He left as a lieutenant after deploying twice in Iraq with SEAL Team 3. Thank you for your service, Rob. Before I turn it over to Rob, I'd like to make a couple of notes. Rob will take questions periodically throughout the presentation. Please enter your questions in the chat, and our chat monitor, Roger Hesketh, will present your question to Rob when he pauses for Q&A. I'd now like to turn it over to Rob. All yours.
Thanks a lot, Deanna. How's everyone doing? I know that that's a loaded question with like 50 people on a Zoom call, but hello. And thank you for joining. Thanks for being interested in your personal development to become a developer. I think it's extremely important for our city. And I say this to anyone that I can get in front of. You know, we need more developers in the city. We are doing very well in terms of seeing some progress, seeing some new things open, seeing the housing stock rise. But at the same time, more could be done. And if we really want to take the progress that's been made and ignite, you know, this is a great way to do it, just training everyone on how to get there. So I will do my best to not steer you wrong. If you make an investment based on what I'm telling you here tonight, don't hunt me down if it doesn't work. I can't guarantee that there's, you know, a bucket of gold at the end of the tunnel. But I can tell you that this is a really worthwhile and rewarding experience to not only get involved in your community, but build your net worth and experience a lot of different things that ultimately lead to being smarter and more knowledgeable in business writ large, not just in real estate. So with that said, our topic tonight is the capital stack, essentially. And that's not the official title, but that's what you're going to hear when you talk about sourcing a deal. And what I mean about sourcing a deal is basically just compiling the stack of money that you're going to need to pull off the project. And after you've identified all the different sources of capital for your project, basically everything else is just timing and how you glue that together. And I make it sound very simple, but at the end of the day, there's a few methods that really work and are kind of standard. And then as you go along and you get more experience under your belt, you'll start to see how there's different wiggle room here and there, different financial vehicles, different things. But today we're going to start with the basics. If you count tax credit basics, I guess, but we're starting with the basics. And then we're going to take questions at the end. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding of how to build your capital stack for any size deal you're looking to do. Deanna, you want me to share my screen? I have that ability if you want. Well, at least I
Yes,
think
you
I
can share
do.
your screen.
Let's make sure I don't send you like vacation pictures or something. Hold on. Share screen. All right. And supposed to be. You seeing the report or no? Are you seeing this?
We're seeing a Zoom pop up on the screen. We just saw your presentation. If you want to navigate that, that's it. Maximize. And
Okay, cool. All right. And you already did this. We're here. Okay.
yeah. So if you want to go to slideshow, perfect.
Okay, there we go. So, assembling your project financing, that's the official name of this course. And I wanted to be cute and funny in the very beginning, but then the rest of it is pretty serious, or at least it's not as, I promise you, it's not all a joke. So the first one is sources and uses, and everything else is timing. Sources and uses is a common term, and this is basically a table, and I'll show you that table. So when you're talking with a bank, when you're talking with fellow developers, when you're talking with anyone about your project, sources and uses is almost as common as hearing tax return or as hearing income statement or as hearing balance sheet. Sources and uses is just like that. And basically it's a ledger, and on either side is your sources for the project, your loan, your equity, etc. And the other side is your uses for the project. I'm going to buy the building. I'm going to do this architecture. I'm going to do this renovation. So we'll take a look at one of those and how it can transform in a minute. Next, size matters. Loan sizing. This is a huge one because you're ultimately not necessarily sure when you're looking at a potential real estate development how much money you can/want to borrow to do this. And you'll find that in real estate, debt is a big instrument. In fact, in real estate investments, because they are real assets, meaning that if you screw up, the bank gets to take it back, you can usually go up fairly high in terms of how much of the value of the property you can source with bank debt. It's the biggest source of capital you'll get for your project. So knowing how to understand that loan size and what the bank is going to be looking at to determine your loan size is very important. Next is, raising your allowance. How do you find the rest? Go to your friends, family, and then small investors. This one's a little more tricky, but I wanted to put this second because the two main sources are debt and equity. Everything else is kind of the accoutrement or the extra. So the equity is important because while it's hard to find, or at least you think it's hard to find, once you start doing it, it becomes easier and easier, especially if you're successful with it. Because at the end of the day, people who have savings, people who have, are looking to invest into things, like to diversify their portfolio. And if you talk to someone who's raised or who saved a little bit of money and they have a little bit in stocks, a little bit in bonds, the other stuff, what you can do sometimes is convince them that a real estate investment is a good one. And you can explain how an investment into your real estate project will fit that diversification. So we'll hit equity and the ways to find it there. Nextly is, I put this stupid moniker, but I think it's kind of funny. I'm not going to try it like the cereal with Mikey. I forget which cereal was, Pops or something. But anyway, the reason I put that for grants is because if a grant exists, and grant financing or grant funding is very important, at least to my line of work. If a grant exists, it's usually because there's a private market deficiency in the area that you're looking to develop. So that's why it says I'm not going to try it, because ultimately the government or some entity is stepping in to say, hey, the cost of bricks and wood is known. The rents in the area are also known. The two do not match up, and therefore we need to subsidize this real estate project if we're going to see real estate work in this area. And I just want to go over some amazing things about it and some pitfalls that come along with it, because of course it does not guarantee success just because you're getting some free money. Lastly is tax credits, and I just said, sure, why not? That's because they're kind of complex, and this could be a master class all in itself, but they are important to what I do, and therefore they might become important to what you do. And so I at least will touch on them. This is the most dangerous topic to talk about because I am not a tax professional. And the most, if I know 10 people who have been to jail, 9 of them have been to jail for tax fraud. So I am very careful to not tell you how to use tax credits. That is up to you how to figure that out. But I can at least tell you the real estate side of how they work. And then lastly, interest reserve. This is basically the glue that holds everything together. I say part debt, part payment because it's basically, as we'll learn, it starts off as something that's a part of your uses, or that starts off as a part of your uses, but eventually becomes something that the project supports itself. Don't worry about it. We'll get into it. Then lastly, of course, the struggle is real, and that's for site control, because at the end of the day, that's when the rubber meets the road. All of your sourcing and all of the different pots of money that you have identified get stack up to get the job done. It all meets the road when you go for site control, as in you get that purchase and sale contract and your deposit goes hard. And now at this point, if you don't fulfill your sources and uses, if you don't get all those sources and you don't move through with the project, you're actually out some money at this point. So that's where the struggle is. So next slide, and getting into the sources and uses, or excuse me, let's real quick before we hit those topics. I just want to remind everyone about financing in general, because I think this is important. Remember, when we're talking about financing, you're talking about other people's money. And what does that mean to you? How does that make you feel? And the reason I say this is because, most of the times, at least my experience, when you're dealing with a real estate investment, the amount of money that you're going to see go through your account or go through a account is more money than you've seen personally. And it can be very daunting when that happens, because it's you realize that if this goes sideways or what have you, you might not necessarily have the money to rebound from it. So just make sure you understand that as long as you have an appreciation that whenever you're talking about financing, whether it's a bank's money, whether it's an investor's money, whether it's the state's money through a grant where they're hoping that you do something good with it, you're always talking about other people's money. So have some respect for it. Risk and return, the cost to you goes up with risk accepted by the financing party. What does this mean? As we talk through all these different vehicles, you're going to notice that the rate that each of them charges or demands is different. And this has to do with the amount of risk they're taking on. These are very basic and general concepts, so I'm not going to belabor it. But I always love to show a little table, and this could be wrong. This is not up to date with the current 30-year Treasury and whatnot. But basically, if you look at the scale, a very basic scale of what investors are looking at in terms of when they passively invest in something, meaning that all they do is write a check, like buying a stock or buying a bond, and then they sit back and they watch the returns grow. Well, this is a common scale. And the 30-year Treasury is known as the risk-free rate, meaning that everyone kind of says, hey, well, by the way, this is a caveat, a lot of people might think the government goes broke, but everyone's basically saying, hey, the US government's never going to go broke. So the fact that they're offering 3% on their money means that it's risk-free. You're definitely going to make 3% on your money. That's why they call it the risk-free rate. That's the floor. And you go up from there. Corporate bonds, as in companies who issue bonds, they have to pay a little more to the investor because they're not quite the US government. And you have the long-term average of the US stock market. Hopefully everyone on this call bought GameStop, and this is just a hobby of theirs now, and they're super rich. But if not, the long-term average of the stock market, if you look over like a 20-year period, is about a 7%, 8% return. So that's where you do, if you buy a bunch of stocks and you say, hey, just set it to a bunch of risky ones and safe ones and blah, 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 over 20 years, it's known that you're going to make about 7% compounding on your money. And then you get into the private equity returns and hedge funds returns. So private equity is where we are if you get an investor. It is a private person investing into your project. That is a private equity return. And that's why I show that you should be targeting around 10% to be attractive to get that equity money into your deal. It could be 700%. It all depends. But ultimately, if you're putting it down on paper and you're showing it to someone to invest in your project as an equity investor, you're going to want to be around a 10% return or higher. Hedge funds, whatever. I don't know that world, but they make a lot of money. And or they lose a lot of money. The risk goes up as you go up in percentages. And I just think that's important to note as we go through these sourcing methods. And then lastly, exercise moderation and you will survive. Basically, real estate's very cyclical. It's something that comes and goes in big waves, and you need to be able to be protected when the tide goes out. So if someone's offering you 100% financing, if someone's offering you 90% loan to value, if someone's offering you a big chunk of debt financing where there's, debt, as we'll discuss, keep on ticking. There's no stopping in the amount of money you owe them every single month. And if you miss one, usually they have the right to take it all away from you. So just be careful when you're looking at these lending opportunities that come your way. So now into the meat of the course. Here's the sample project we'll be working with. This is my newest project called Girard and Tatnall. It is a 5-building historic renovation with a new building built on the back. So if you look, there's 5 little walk-ups in the front, which will be turning into apartments with a nice little rooftop deck there. And then the building in the back is going to be a 3-story new build, stick-built building. So this is the project that we'll be using to look through the sources and uses of the project at hand. So here are the sources and uses for Girard and Tatnall. You can see what I'm talking about when I say this is as common as an income statement, as common as a balance sheet, as common as a tax return when it comes to documents that folks are looking for. This is a very simple sheet that shows your sources on the left, where you're getting the money, and your uses on the right, what you're going to use it for. Is it going to be perfect every time? Of course not, but you get better as you go. And really, you start with the uses side. You start adding up all the different costs that you're going to use for your project, and you're going to determine ultimately, how much the ultimate cost is. And there is a certain point at which your project transitions from a construction budget to an operation budget, and that is a point in time that you need to decide. For everyone on this call, I'm guessing you're going to start off with smaller projects, so it's fairly simple to say, hey, look, anything I say in the first 12 months I'm going to spend, I'm going to make sure that that money is in my uses. And then anything in month 13 and on will be a part of the operation budget, meaning you plan on covering those with the rent you collect. But you do have to pick a point in time in which you're going to stop charging things to this budget, because ultimately that's where your sources will be capped. And ultimately, you're trying to get to that point where the property is operating at a profit, and your costs that come in are no longer capitalized or are no longer considered construction uses, but rather your ongoing operations. So if we look at the uses side, I don't want to get into too much of that because we get bogged down, but basically some of the terms that you might not be familiar with are FF&E, that's furniture, fixture, and equipment. That means that this project, I'm not paying for any of the equipment or the furniture in the project. Let's see, you see interest reserve. We'll talk about how you calculate that later, but essentially what that is paying the bank while you're still under construction and you don't have any revenues. TI allowance, that's a tenant improvement allowance. So basically, when you have a potential tenant for a retail space, oftentimes in a lease with a retail tenant, they agree to some rent, but then you also in turn agree to pay for some fit out in their space. So if you look at our project, it's a $2.5 million project where we have a little bit of money for the retail space. We're not paying for any of the equipment or the furniture in the project. It's a walk-up apartment building. There's no need for any furniture. And ultimately, you have your uses budget. Going over to the sources side now, you see about $1.5 million in debt. That's a senior loan. We'll discuss how to size that next. You have your tax credit proceeds net. What does that mean? Basically, the way I like to do it is I like to calculate all of the different carrying costs associated with those tax credits. I like to net them all out before I put it on my sources and uses. It's up to you if you want to do that. And I don't want to get too technical, but basically, tax credits come in at different times, and there is a cost to bridging them forward. And you can either show that on your uses side and then show the entire amount of the tax credits on your sources side, or you can net them out and then just put them on the sheet after you've already netted that amount out, so you know how much is actually coming to your project to pay for bricks and sticks, not going towards financing the tax credits themselves. DDD is the same thing. It's net because you get a grant from the state. It's downtown development district. We'll get into that a little bit, but ultimately they give you the money at the end of your project. Well, what happens if you need it at the beginning of your project to get going? Because I don't have an extra $185,000 sitting around. I need to bridge that grant from the end of the project forward. There are groups like Cinnaire that will do that for you, but they also, of course, charge some interest. And so I subtract all that out before I put this number into my sources. Again, you can do it however you want. You can put the net, you can put the entire amount of the grant in if you want. Just make sure on your uses side you're accounting for any bridging costs. Me, I take them out and then I put it in. Deferred equity is the fun one because it means that I'm not getting paid, which is just normal. It's the contribution of the developer fee, as you'll see. So you as the developer, if you were doing this project for somebody else, if you were doing this project, let's say Christiana Care hired you to build a building, all the amount of time that you spend building the sources and uses, investigating those costs, doing all the work that you're doing, those are all something that you get paid for. That's your developer fee. You're a developer. You're actually doing something. However, I'm guessing most of the people on this call, including myself, aren't doing third-party development. So you're doing it for yourself. You are the developer and you're also the owner. So why would I put in a developer fee? Why would I put in paying myself in this stack? Well, it turns out that tax credit calculations, some banks and some other things value your time as a developer. And even though you're not paying yourself because it's your project, they still will count that towards equity that you're putting into the project. So I add it in, but I also take it out. So I show that, yeah, hey, $45,000 seems reasonable to me. There's different ways and different market ways to determine if that's a typical rate for a project this size. I put it on the one side, I take it out on the other. It just is an acknowledgement that it's there. And if people want to size stuff based on it, and it's there. And then lastly, of course, is the plug, and that's your equity. So anything that's left over after you've added up all your sources is equity. And then, of course, you get to determine what the value is to that equity, meaning that if that equity number were $1 million in this case, the rents on the other side would not produce an attractive equity investment. So I have to go back to the drawing board. Whereas as my current equity of 620 grand comes in, it turns out that I can return a decent profit to those equity investors for that amount of for that amount of equity. And so the project moves forward. I was trying to think of something to express the two big parts and then everything in the middle. I thought of a sandwich. And the reason is because basically you have the two big components, the debt and the equity are kind of like the bread. And then all the other stuff is just the in between. Now, granted, this is a bad picture because it should be like a submarine sandwich where the bottom layer of bread is much thinner than the top layer. Because like I said, the equity, but still you can think of it as a sandwich. And that's why, you're really worried about the debt and the equity. And then the other things are kind of just the nice inside that makes it taste good or makes it worth eating as opposed to just eating bread. And that's, where I live is in the tax credit downtown development district grant world, where if I were doing what I was doing in the neighborhoods I am without that stuff, it would not make economic sense. But because they exist, then I got a nice sandwich. So that's what I was thinking of. And then we have, let's see here. Sometimes it is challenging to describe everything else to lenders. That's all I'm saying when it's kind of along the lines of what I just described with deferred developer fee. When you're talking to different people, like when you're talking with the bank, or when you're talking with your equity investors, or when you're talking with the grant folks, not all of these different sources care or know about all the different things that you're doing. They like to see it, they ask you for your sources and uses, etc. But just realize that the lender has certain things that they care about. And if you start talking too much about tax credits and stuff like that, they start getting freaked out and they don't understand that world. They're not used to that world. So when you're talking to folks, just remember, don't try to confuse them with all the other things you have going on. Focus on what they're focused on, which for a bank is pretty straightforward. Is the project worth, can an appraiser show up and tell me that this project is worth X, and therefore my lending limits say I will, do 75% of that or whatever. But just be careful, because I've gotten into trouble sometimes where you're confusing people with all the different ways that you stack this capital up. And then lastly, of course, is also along the same lines as the developer fee. With that said, try to poke and prod to find out if the lender will count any of those things as equity. What I mean is usually the bank says, oh, well, you have to have 20% skin in the game. Well, if you don't have 20% skin in the game, what if you went out and got a grant for that 20%? What if you went out and got tax credits worth that amount? Will the bank look at that and say, yeah, well, you went out and secured all that, so I'll count that as your equity? So that's one thing that can help you as well. So it's a delicate balance between confusing folks and getting them to see the value of what you've cobbled together as your sweat equity. So the fundamentals, and I'll run through these quickly because a lot of them are somewhat, we talked a little bit about these already, and then some of them are kind of not necessarily valuable for people at our phase. We can go out and get multiple quotes from banks to see if we're getting the right rate and all that. But a lot of times when you're a new developer, you're just a taker. You're just taking what's available, and you're taking the rate because you have an unproven track record, because you're doing this for the first time, what have you. But ultimately, as you get better, you get to shop around a little bit. But let's go into these four real quick. So first, here is the debt, the how much I can borrow question. This one is important because it gets back to our central question of size matters. How much debt can I expect when I'm looking at a new project? Well, there's two main criteria. The first is called debt service constrained, and the second is called loan to value. What does this mean ultimately? Well, the debt service constrained is one that looks at the ultimate performance year to year of your project and says, okay, if they're going to make X a year, then I'm comfortable lending to a certain percentage of that number that they can pay me a year. So it's looking basically at an operating year over year basis. Then you have the loan to value approach. This means that they get an appraiser to come out and tell them that, yes, this property, when completed, because there's two different types of appraisals, as is and as completed. As is says, okay, today this dumpy building that Rob Snowberger is going to buy is worth nothing. But after he does X amount of construction, it'll be worth this. They look at that number that the appraiser says, and they put an arbitrary or defined percentage that they will loan. So let's go back to debt service constraint. That one is basically looking at what they believe your monthly, year over year plotting every year, like clockwork, money's coming in, and they calculate the loan based on that. And I'll go over specifically how they do that in a minute. And then the next one is a longer term approach, saying ultimately this building is worth this. I'm going to go ahead and say I'll loan 75% of that value, and that's my loan size. So looking at this sheet here, start with the income approach table. You'll see that I have stabilized revenue, which is what I'm saying in year 3. When I add up all the rents I'm going to be getting, that's what I'm going to be getting. And of course, you have a little bit allowance for people not paying your rent. It just happens, but we're not in that class today. It'll take too much time. But anyway, that's my revenue that I'm projecting in year 3. The expenses that I'm projecting in year 3 are there, and therefore my stabilized net operating income. Don't forget, or at least the quick down and dirty of NOI, is that you don't subtract anything you pay to the banks from your NOI. That comes below NOI. So banks are looking at your NOI because ultimately, if a rich person came along and bought your building from you, they might have a completely different funding slash borrowing capacity. So usually when you're talking to banks, you're looking at the net operating income because that means that you can switch out them for another bank, for another person, et cetera. And it all goes below NOI. NOI is your net operating income. That is your rents minus your expenses, not including what you pay banks. So for me, I have 144 grand. DSCR stands for debt service constrained ratio. And what that means is the bank is telling me that they will only give me a loan that is sized 1.25%, or not percent, but basically that NOI is 1.25 times their debt service payment. And you can see that line below, max debt service payment defines that. So basically they're saying if you make 144,000 in NOI, I'm only going to give you a loan in which your total loan payment for that year is 115,000. That gives you that nice little buffer between 144 and 115 that they say, look, if you screw up and you lose a bunch of tenants or whatever, and I'm still likely to get paid by basically this ratio. And 1.25 is a pretty standard debt service coverage ratio. So if you divide 1.44 by that number, you'll get the 115, and that's how you come up with the debt service. Then you have to, of course, put in your assumptions for what your rate is, for how long the loan is, which is your amortization, your term, and your interest only. This is kind of getting into the weeds, but in essence, just realize that the NOI defines what they're willing to lend you on an annual basis of how much you can afford to pay them. And that payment is not just interest. That payment is everything. That payment includes your total payment. So if you have a mortgage on your house and you pay every single month, that payment includes both principal and interest. This number here is the total debt service payment, which includes principal and interest as well. So that's how the bank determines that little margin of safety between the 144 and the 115. That's how they determine how much they're going to lend to you. And if you put it into the Excel calculator, which I can make a tutorial later how to do it, it spits out what the loan size is based on that criteria, and that's 1.5 million. Then if you look over at the loan to value approach, you take the same number, which is that nice NOI number, the 144, and what you do is you have to assume, or you have to research what the cap rate is in your area. Cap rate is a shorthand way of describing a long understood concept, which is ultimately, if you're going to sell your building today, how much is someone who's going to buy it willing to pay in terms of your year-to-year cash flow? Meaning, how many times in addition to your annual NOI will they pay? So if it's a 7% cap rate, what you do is you take the 144, you divide it by your cap rate, and it spits out a value. So if you have a calculator, do that math right there. It's 144, 715 divided by that 7% cap rate, and it spits out what ultimately my project is worth, which is 2.143. $2 million. And the bank then takes that number, which is given to them by the appraiser, and they put a loan to value limit on what they will lend against that. And as you can see, that lends a $1.6 million loan. So one approach shows you a $1.5 million loan. The other approach shows you a $1.6 million loan. And so which one's the bank's going to choose? The lowest one. They always look at the lowest criteria because that's the least risk for them. So in this project, I'm showing that the income approach, which is the DSCR approach, is the way that the bank is going to look at how to size my loan. You could get somebody who forgoes that and goes the loan to value approach. You could have someone that doesn't even use DSCR, and instead of a 75% loan to value, use an 80% loan to value. So they give you an even bigger loan. There are banks out there who will do that, but it's harder when you're new at the game. And then, of course, you have to decide for yourself if you're comfortable levering up, as they say, taking on more debt than you potentially want to take on and taking on that risk. Because if something does happen, I don't know, if a pandemic strikes and people don't pay their rent, you could be really in danger if you don't have a level of safety. So ultimately, this is a decision that you can make, but the bank most of the times will make it for you. And lastly, real quick, there is a loan to costs, which basically says if you take your sources and uses and you look at the value of the uses, meaning that bottom line number, they'll loan a certain percentage loan to cost. But that one I haven't really seen in our as a criteria, because typically your debt service constrained approach is going to be the smallest, just in general. But it also depends on your cap rate, stuff like that. Before I go to the next slide, I feel like I might have confused folks on the cap rate thing. Just know that it's basically a measure. It's just a ratio number that is somewhat arbitrary in terms of what is a good one and is a bad, and it's completely market dependent. Just know that because it's a denominator, as you go down, so if that cap rate were to compress from 7% to 5%, that means that when you divide that 144 by 5%, that ultimate value of the 2-1 goes up. And so cap rate is a number, as it goes down, it means that people are willing to pay more for your cash flow. So 7% I thought was a pretty fair downtown Wilmington real estate multifamily cap rate. And again, the appraiser will do this, but I suggest to take a note and look up cap rates online after this if you're not familiar with them. And then ultimately, it's how much do you want to borrow? So these are the same tables that you've just seen, except I chose that instead of borrowing 1.57, I just wanted to borrow 1.5. So therefore, what I'm saying is I told the bank I want to borrow a little less than they'd be willing to approve in their loan. That's just for me. I like whole numbers like that. I think it makes sense to ask for a $1.5 million loan instead of a 1.571. But ultimately, you can do this math on your own to determine what you think a bank will lend you. And then after that, you can decide how much you actually want to borrow, not what they're going to let you borrow. So that's just another factor. Am I getting the best rate? I told you already that this slide's pretty short, because until you're successful, ultimately you're a taker of this rate, and usually it's higher for first-time developers. It just, you're risky, so they have to put you into a different pool. But at the same time, you can shop around. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And if you're asking when a bank tells you its rate, typically it's on a term sheet. It's not always on a term sheet, but you basically get to a term sheet when you send a banker an email and you send them a book, meaning that you send them a short PowerPoint about your project, picture of the project, sources and uses, all this little calculus that we've just done here, showing them, hey, I've got a loan opportunity. Do you have 1.5 million that you want to lend? We'll lend it to this project. It's safe. You'll get your money back, blah, blah, blah. It's just a pitch deck, basically. You send that around the bankers. They respond back saying, yes, I'm into this asset class. Yes, I'm into this area. Yes, I'd like to work with you. And, then you start sending some stuff back and forth to them, such as rent rolls, if it's an existing property, your personal financial statements, if you're personally guaranteeing the loan. The banker will let you know what they want to see. But at some point, after you send them a pretty cursory amount of stuff, they're going to issue you a term sheet and saying, okay, I believe what you're saying, and here is a letter on bank letterhead that says we will lend you 1.5 million for a 30% amortization with this rate, etc. And usually there's a time clock on that rate, meaning that you have to commit to it within a certain amount of time for them to lock in that rate for you. And if you don't, and you have to enter a whole new term sheet because the rates have moved. That's just how banks work. But if you want to shop around to get different term sheets, you certainly can, and I would recommend that. But again, in the beginning, it's tough to get. Really to compete on rates to get them down if you're just starting out. Usually government debt. So if you can get into the HUD program or a DSHA program, is always going to be your best bet when it comes to rates. But the process is long and competitive, and most of the time they need to be relatively sizable projects. That might not be true, but the ones that I've dealt with have all been larger projects. And even though the rates were great, it literally was like for the HUD loan that I did for Midtown, which is that big apartment building in the downtown, that was a 1.5-year process to get HUD to lend us the money. So I'd look into government debt and government programs for sure. because not only do they, offer better rates, but also, there's a mortgage insurance component to it typically, where, instead of you personally guaranteeing the debt, the government personally guarantees the debt. And that is a really big thing, which we'll get into. And then lastly, CDFIs are usually your best bet until you're bankable. And they're always going to be a good bet for you, but ultimately they charge a little bit higher rates simply because they're dealing with a riskier portfolio. They might have some programs that don't charge heavier rates, and Deanna is the perfect person to tell you about all that. But me, when I started out, I worked heavily with CDFIs. CDFI is a community development financial institution. They're the Cinnaires, they're the True Access Capitals. They're the folks who have a socially conscious and mission-driven investing, and they're out there trying to help folks like us get started in this business. And they're really great to work with. As you can see, I've had tremendous success working with them, and they ultimately launched my career, so I'm grateful. But anyway, CDFIs, definitely go that route as you're starting out. Personal guarantee. If you don't understand what this is, this slide will be very important to you. So basically, when you set up an LLC, it's limited liability company, right? True. However, have you ever heard of piercing the corporate veil? Well, what that means is that you just can't go willy-nilly with an LLC and run it into the ground and have the bank to say, oh, well, all my loan documents were with the LLC. So, Rob Snowberger and his new Ferrari are just fine. No, that's not how it works. Usually in real estate, until you become super wealthy, you have to sign what's called a personal guarantee for that money, meaning that your name, not you, your LLC, are promising to pay that money back. And so if you don't pay it back, then they can come after your assets outside of that LLC. There are laws in states, and I luckily have not ever had to find this out, but there are certain protections against your home and stuff like that. I don't Onomatopoeia, I don't want to see, I don't want to know. I just don't want to ever lose that money. So just realize that you're signing that personal guarantee, and oftentimes it's also your spouse signing that personal guarantee. So like me, you have to get good at having conversations about buying even more depressed real estate. But it's it depends on the lender, it depends on what they want, it depends on the comfort. Um, you know, if you have to give up your wife or your husband as a guarantor, maybe you ask for a little better rate. They're getting more security, so why not knock the rate down a little bit? These are the things that you'll get comfortable with as you talk through it and work through it. But I can tell you one of the reasons why I worked with CDFIs in the beginning was because they accepted my personal guarantee, and they didn't require me to actually have guarantors with enough net worth that would actually be worthwhile, meaning that I didn't have to go and find a co-signer. I didn't have to go and ask my parents to, co-sign their retirement savings or what have you. CDFI said, look, we need a personal guarantee so that we know that you're personally invested. But even though we look at your personal financials and you're not going to pay us back because you have no money, we'll still just take that. So there are some things that CDFIs are more lenient on, and they really trust you, and they trust your ability to work hard to make this work. And so that's another good reason to look at CDFIs when you're first starting. But ultimately, I just want to show you that, what secures a bank loan? Well, it's a mortgage on the property, meaning that yes, if you screw up, they get the property. Second, they of course get assignment of all the rent. So it's just something that basically says anybody that's a tenant of yours, if you screw up, they get the rent, not you. And then default provisions there's several of them when you look at loan docs, and please get a lawyer when it comes to signing on to these big loans. Make sure you read the contract. Very important. Don't ever just say, oh, this is a standard loan contract, I'm good. Read it to the tail, but you can see all the different ways in which they count the default. And then of course, lastly is a personal guarantee, which you're just going to have to sign until your net worth is so large that you can just say, look, I'm not signing that. And you have 70 different banks you can go to. You're basically going to be signing personal guarantees. And even if you get wealthy, typically you have to personal guarantee a project during its construction phase, and then you can usually get it to burn off after you finish construction. So anyway, a real quick note at the bottom there is if you want to calculate your personal financial statements now, which is something you're going to have to do regardless of who you go with, there's a nice SBA form out there that you can find, and it basically walks you through adding up all of the loans you have, your credit card debt, all of your assets, et cetera. And it allows you to kind of see a nice snapshot of where you're at. And don't be discouraged because it takes a long time to make that thing look good, but it's just something that you're going to have to provide. So you might as well just get a good snapshot now. As you do a few projects, it starts to look better. I can guarantee that. So now we have equity. We're on to the unsecured money. So what is the bank has a security in the project, meaning that the bank has a mortgage. If you don't pay the bank every single month like clockwork, they get to take the property from you. They're somewhat secured in that. And then as we discussed, they have personal guarantees, meaning that they could go to court and get a judgment to take your cars and some other things away if you're a they call it a bad boy, bad girl provision. Here, equity is not secured by those things, and it's largely based on trust, meaning that because it's unsecured, yes, you have to pay them more money, but it's largely something that they're not going to control once they write you that check. What defines an equity holder's position in your company? Well, it's defined in the operating agreement. And there's lots of different terms for the operating agreement. It's operating agreement, LLC agreement, partnership agreement, whatever it is. There's different names for it, but it's all the same thing. And basically, that is your defining document that discusses your partnership. So the org docs of an LLC, basically saying that what makes an LLC an actual entity are four things. One is a certificate of formation. And again, this is not a class on setting up an LLC, but just as a refresher, certificate of formation. This is something that you file with the Department of State of Delaware, and they say, yes, Snowberger LLC exists and it started on this date. And then if it's an entity that's been around for a while, and a bank's going to want you to hit up the Department of State and just make sure that they give you a letter of good standing, meaning that you haven't done anything bad in the past. But if it's a new entity, you won't have this. Then you have the EIN letter, which is from the IRS that basically says, yes, Snowberger LLC exists. It was created in Delaware on this date, and here's its tax ID number. And then lastly is your operating agreement. And this is what we're talking about here. The operating agreement talks about the relationship between you, the developer, meaning the person doing all the work, and the equity investor, meaning the person putting up the money. This document defines what your responsibilities are. It defines how they get paid. It defines how you get paid. It defines ownership, etc. You can look up some online, and I recommend you should look up a boilerplate operating agreement. Typically, the ones that you can find online show you the difference between 2 owners and 3 owners. The reason that is because you get into some interesting scenarios when you have an even number of partners versus an odd number, just because of voting rights, right? If you have 2 partners with equal voting shares, you could stay at a stalemate, and there are rules governing that. If you have 3 partners, it's 2 against 1 kind of thing. So look up some operating agreements online and just read through them. It's worth your time. But ultimately, these are the things you look for if you're an equity investor in the operating agreement. You look for the waterfall, which is basically how's the money split up. You look for your ownership shares, meaning, okay, I put up 100% of the money, but I'm only 90% owner because the person doing all of the work is keeping 10% for themselves. And that's called sweat equity. That's basically what I do. Just so you know, what I typically do with my partners is we don't put in any of the money ourselves because we don't have any. But what we do is we keep 10% of the ownership of the project ourselves. And then after 5 years of doing good and returning the money that we said we would to investors, we promote from 10 to 20%. And that's the way that it stays. So basically what you're telling an equity investor is you put up 100% of the cash, I'll do all the work. You own 90% of the project, I own 10. And then after I've performed for you for 5 years, and I've given you the amount of money that I've said, and the project is leased up, etc., then we promote from 10 to 20%. And that's just how it stays until we dispose of the asset. That's what I do. That's something that could work for you guys. It maybe you don't want to work for peanuts like that, but that's what I decided to do. Maybe you can cut yourself a better deal. So don't stick with what I do. Anyway, then aside from the ownership shares, there's the voting shares, which, if you followed WeWork debacle, or if you follow business news, there's all sorts of really fancy ways you can go about voting shares versus operating shares. sometimes CEOs of companies will give themselves like, I don't know, like 100 votes for every one share that they have. So they have like super shares or something. I don't know. If you want to get into all that, great. I don't get into that. But voting shares and ownership shares are the same in my book. But just that's something that equity investors are going to be looking for: who gets voting versus ownership percentages. And then lastly is limited versus general members. What this means is if you're an investor and you're a limited member or a limited partner, a lot of times referred to as an LP, what that means is you get to write a check into the partnership and you have your partnership share, and you're not responsible for anything that that partnership does. But you're also not allowed to tell that partnership what to do at all. So that's when I say this is basically built on trust. When you sell somebody or when you get somebody to invest in your partnership document and they read it and they say, okay, in exchange for my $25,000 check, I'm going to get 10% of this entity, and that should return X amount a year in cash. That person from that moment forward doesn't get to do anything unless you violate this document. That's the only way they get to go to court, and they get to say, hey, we signed this document. This person went to Bermuda with my money, and I get to, sue them and get a judgment. That is what this document is for. But if you do everything that you say you're going to do, and the property still doesn't make money, and the thing falls apart, but you did everything you're supposed to do, well, that's the risk of being an equity investor. Their equity just disappears. That's what happens. So it's the way that you are looking at those risk versus return percentages versus the amount of risk that you take on. An equity investor does not get a check every single month, but at the same time, when that asset sells for 3 times what you bought it for because you're made a smart investment, guess who gets a big chunk of that? The equity investor. So that's where your kind of riskiness comes in, and ultimately how an equity investor is going to look at your investment. So just because, if you have friends and family with cash that you can approach for 5, 10, 25, $50,000 investments, great. If you don't, you don't need it. You just need a good, solid business plan that basically says, hey, look, I found this great asset. It's in this neighborhood here. The rents are this. It's super cheap. Here's the special sauce. You're going to triple your money, right? You're going to find a lot of people who invest in that project. And we just need to put a book together that explains it and make sure that you can explain that story. And that's what my last note is here. Be someone special. Find a way to offer super good in returns, and you will find the equity money. I can guarantee that. This is a complicated slide. I don't want to get too much into it, but it basically describes what I just described. 10% to me, I'm the managing member, and then 20% post promote. If you look at kind of the middle section there, you'll see where the managing member returns are. And then if you go down to the limited members, that's all my equity. That's my people putting an equity into the deal. So you can see in year 0, which is closing, that's i.e. when they send you the check and when you close the financing and you buy the building, that all happens, of course, in a millisecond. That's why it's year 0. But really 0 is closing, and then year 1 is the 12 months following, and then the 12 months following that is year 2, et cetera. So you can see that they put up all the money. I didn't put up any of the money, or, I put up a very de minimis amount. They put up everything, but they only owed 90%. And then after the 5 years of returning to them what they get, then I promote up to 20. And then, of course, tax credits is there at the bottom. I don't want to get into that now. I just want to show you what an equity waterfall looks like. You start with your net cash flow, which essentially is the money that you start with in your NOI. I told you about that before, net operating income. That one you do not take away your debt service payments, but for net cash flow, you do. So NOI, you take out your debt service payments, you get your net cash flow. That is what enters into the equity waterfall. And I would recommend distributing cash to investors once a year. Usually it's on the anniversary of when they sent you the money, but it can be whenever. But I think once a year is what most investors expect to get checks once a year with whatever their distribution is. Again, it could be negative. The property could make no money. You don't owe them anything because they're equity investors just like you. It's not like a bank. You don't have to send them money. But if you want to grow in this business and take care of your folks who invested, you're going to want to try to send them cash. So here's the grants, getting into that. So we've discussed debt and how to size that and what it means to be secured. We've discussed equity, how an equity investor gets into a project and what they actually own when they invest. here's the free money, or here's the money that is like, hey, try this area out for development. The water's fine. The government will give you some money, and this can be the special sauce that makes the project actually viable. Well, this is the DDD grant. This is the Downtown Development District grant. And this is a very common tool that I use in the downtown of Wilmington. There are several of them across the state. If you're interested in this one, DelawareStateHousingAuthority.com, and then the tab for developers, Downtown Development District. Check it out and see if there are areas that have been designated as downtown development districts that you would like to develop in. In general, the downtown of Wilmington, and I think it actually spurs up North Market Street now. They change the map and they edit it often, so check out where the map is now. But simply put, if your project is within those boundaries, and you are, if your project is within those boundaries, and you're doing a certain type of renovation, you could get up to 20% of your hard cost of construction given to you in a check from the state of Delaware. And what that means is, if you look at my project here, how did I calculate that? Well, my QRPI, which stands for, I forget, in fact, it's probably the wrong, but it's Qualified Real Estate Property Investment or something like that. That is essentially the costs that they allow you to say are qualified costs, meaning that they're going to throw their 20% ratio times that number, and they're going to spit out their grant number. So for me, it's relatively simple to take that at the beginning of a project. Hard costs are essentially your construction contract, not your architecture, not your insurance, not your acquisition costs. None of that counts. Just your general contractor's contract, bricks and sticks, hard costs as they're known. That is what DDD is calculated on. Then you'll see, so that was my GC contract. I assumed in my $2.5 million project, 1.3 of it is going to be in a construction contract. So 20% of that is your 276,000. Then, as you'll see, and this is one thing I want to remind you, maybe the next slide, the next slide kind of talks about it. But why do you see tax holdback there? Because grants are income. When you submit this at the end of the year, the IRS will count a grant to you as income unless otherwise stated. And what does that mean? That means that if you're not careful, you could hand a tax bill to your investors, because that is money that, $270,000 is a significant amount of income to receive into a real estate partnership. And usually real estate partnerships, because of depreciation, no matter what the cash flow is, you investing into a real estate group are typically expecting to get losses every year. Minimal losses, but still losses, because even if you produce cash, the depreciation of the buildings overcomes that cash and you hand your investors losses. So what happens if you get a DDD grant for $276,000 and the stuff that you spent it on is capitalized and not an expense? Well, and that means that you're handing a tax bill to your investors. And they can say, whoa, I gave you $25,000. You're handing me a tax bill for $5,000 this first year. What happened? And you can say, oh, shoot, well, I forgot that this is income to my partnership. And so I didn't hold that cash to pay the taxes on it. So for me, to avoid that trap, what I do is I just straight up say, that's wonderful that the check is for 276 grand from the state of Delaware. Thank you very much. Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and assume that 25% of that is going to be held back by me, so that if I hand a tax bill to my investors, I hand them the cash to be able to pay it as well. And that's just something that I have done because I don't want to ever end up in that situation. There are ways to plan around that, and you could definitely talk to an accountant and do better than what I did. I like to be cautious, and so that's what I did. And ultimately, if they don't have to pay it, then that's a nice, $69,000 that I have to put back into the project. So that's where I do that. Then you end up with the net of that. So the 276 is the grant. I hold back 70 grand to pay taxes on it. And then there's my bridgeable amount. When I say bridgeable, what that means is that I assume that at the end of the project, when I get my grant, I will be able to pay back this amount in bridge funds. That's where the next little green circle comes into play. It just shows you the amount of money that I'm going to count out of that bridge or out of that loan, or out of that grant, excuse me, so that I can get the proceeds today at the beginning of the project instead of tomorrow after the project's done. So that's what that is. As you can see, it's basically the same thing as a regular loan. They're going to charge you interest for the amount of times, for the amount of months that you have it outstanding. There's a small fee that's associated with doing a bridge loan, and then usually you have to pay for the lender's legal fees. So ultimately, I'm subtracting $22,000 out of my bridgeable grant of 207, and I end up with my net project proceeds of 185. That's the number that goes into my sources and uses. That's the number that I put into my sources for this grant. So even though the grant, again, is 270 grand, what ends up on my sheet? 185 grand, because of all this extra stuff that I'm trying to take care of. Up to you how you do it. You could put the 270 right on your sheet and put all this junk into a uses category. But either way, end of the day, you're going to want to end up with the proper amount to be able to pay off these things. And for me, 185 is what I'm counting on going towards the project itself. And then lastly, the bottom thing is just showing you the reservation letter that you get. So after you look up a grant program that you like, you apply for the grant. Depending on the next slide kind of talks about site control or not. Sometimes you have to own the project, or excuse me, sometimes you have to own the property in order to apply for grant programs. Sometimes all you need is a purchase and sale agreement that you have not executed yet, meaning that you can apply for a grant while you're still determining whether or not you want to buy the project. Oftentimes, I do that all the time. I'll get a project under contract and I will submit for the grant program because I know I don't want to buy the building unless I get the grant. So I will build in enough time in my due diligence to apply for that grant and see what comes back before I pull the trigger on buying the building. That's just what this talks about here. Site control, maybe or maybe not. Look at the grant program and what they determine. Timing, make sure that you understand that most grants, when you receive them, they have a time clock that starts that says, hey, from the moment you get this, you got to finish this project in 24 months. Just be conscious of that. Don't forget about tax implications. Again, please talk to a tax person. But ultimately, the government taxes an LLC just like it taxes an individual person. So if that LLC receives 200 grand of free money, well, they say, that's nice, Peanut. Pay me my taxes on that 200 grand. So just be careful of that. It doesn't make sense. Trust me, I get it. Why would government money go back to pay government money? But that's just what they do. Grants, again, this is a good source of equity, meaning that you can convince the banks that, hey, I went out and got this grant. You should count that as equity. And sometimes they will allow you to do that, which means that, you don't necessarily have to put up your own cash to have quote unquote skin in the game. You went out, you got this grant, you did that work. That's your skin in the game. Bridge loans, we just talked about that. And then lastly is that note that I kind of talked to you about, which is to say, just because it's like, oh my gosh, Snowberger just got 270 grand from the government. Holy crap, I'm going to do that. Well, there's a reason for it. And it's not meant to be this free pot of money for folks who are just already killing it out there. It's meant to be because there is a gap between doing this work and what the rent on the other side will get you. And so it is a tool to be used, but it is to be respected. And if you do a great job and you get to keep it, wonderful. But really, I've never seen that. It always is a tool to get to a stable, sensible real estate return. And yes, I hope ultimately all my stuff appreciates in the next 10 years and I become a billionaire. That'd be wonderful. But in general, this is not how you get rich. This is how you get the project completed and get it stabilized. Tax credits I'm going to talk about very briefly because the rabbit hole is really deep. But basically, tax credits are a tool that can be used for lots of different things. And it's the way that the government says, hey, I like what you're doing, but instead of putting up money, like sending you a check, which a grant is, instead, I'm going to give you a chit to not have to pay taxes on what you're doing, meaning that you produce something that is the government foregoing money in the future, as opposed to the government putting money up right now. And there's three main types that you'll see. There's others out there too. I mean, I know that there's energy tax credits and stuff, but in the development world, you're largely see historic credits, low income credits, and new markets credits. The historic credits are fairly simple in terms of you need a historic building, and I'd recommend you look up the National Park Service website and read through that. But essentially, there's a 3-part program. There's a part 1, part 2, and part 3. The part one is you saying, hey, is this building historic? It looks historic to me. And here's my argument as to why. And they get to come back and they say either yes or no. If the answer is yes, you're invited to submit a part two. The part two is your plan for renovation, keeping the historic nature of the project intact. And they respond back saying, oh, that's great. But you know that wonderful grand staircase you're going to demolish that's not up to code? You got to keep it. Sorry. And they say, okay. And then you will rework your plan until you get to a happy medium between what the historic folks need to see in the project and what works for your layouts, your apartment layouts, your stairwells, all that other stuff. And then lastly, when you do the project, you submit a part three with some nice pretty pictures of what you've done. And if you do that, and you get what is a reservation of tax credits. In Delaware, there are two types. There are the Delaware state credits, and then there are the federal credits. Both of them are valuable. The state credits are much easier to sell, meaning that there are some serious nuances behind offloading these things for cash. So the Delaware state tax credits are easy to sell. You submit this to the state. They send you a piece of paper at the end of your project saying, congratulations, you've done it. Here are your tax credits. I can literally hand that piece of paper over to a buyer and they send me a check and we're done with it. Meaning that a big bank like Discover or a big bank like Wisfis or whomever, they have a Delaware state tax liability. And instead of paying $100 of cash for their taxes, they'd rather pay you $90 for a certificate for $100, and then they pay their taxes with that. So they just made a 10% return, and we just talked about returns, right? The bank just made a 10% return by paying me 90 cents for something that's worth $1. Very simple, right? Very simple to sell Delaware state tax credits. Federal tax credits, much harder to sell. And there's way too many nuances to go into tonight. But in essence, let's assume that if you're doing a project that's smaller than the project that I just showed you, you're not going to be selling those federal credits to anyone. It's the IRS has a lot stricter policies on how you can pass along those credits. And if you want to talk about it offline, I can. But if you'll notice, and I don't want to go all the way back to my sorts and uses for this project, but if you notice, actually, I don't have to. If you look here on the green circle, I count the value of state tax credits in my capital stack, meaning that I plan on selling the state credits for cash. And you can see that it basically went through the same math that the DDD went through. You start with your eligible costs, you add the percentage that they give you, and then you take the bridging out of it because it's the same thing. This is something you get at the end of the project. You need to move it forward. That costs you something, and you end up with your net tax credit cash that you can count towards the project. That lower green bubble is the federal credits. And you can see that that $137,000 number is the same as the fourth line down in the state calc of 137. I produced the same amount of tax credits on the federal level that I did on the state level, but I am not counting that money in my sources because I can't sell them. My project is too small. It's too hard to sell these federal credits on a small project basis. And so what happens? I just give them to my investors as a nice little extra for investing in my project, meaning that as a part of the calculation that they are calculating in terms of getting an annual return, trying to get to that 10% number we talked about. Well, in this particular project, the investors that I found were interested in tax credits. And so I produce about a 6% return with my cash year over year. And then the 4% that gets me to the 10 or above is in tax credits. So that's just something that's a little bit advanced. But if you're interested in tax credit investing or developing, do some research and we can try to maybe create some sort of a program for that because it's very complex and there are a lot of pitfalls. But it is a way to help you to finance a project. I have only done one low-income project. It's competitive, and it's also another topic that we're going to have to talk about in a different class. And the new markets are extremely competitive, but that's basically for the government trying to subsidize setting up new commercial opportunities, job creation opportunities. If your project is a job creator, especially in low-income neighborhoods, then look into new markets projects because you might find somebody that has an allocation who's willing to help you out. But new markets is basically for if you can definitively say that your real estate project creates a certain amount of jobs, then you can go after new markets tax credits. I'm very sorry for truncating this portion. Some of you might be more interested than others, but again, it's too complex, and we'll have to find a way to bridge the gap between what you want to know and what this course can provide. Interest reserve. This is just to show you how intense it gets. So interest reserve is basically, and I'll really describe the meat of it on the next slide, but interest reserve is how you take, if you notice on this sheet, you'll see sources and uses at the top, or you'll see on the left-hand column, you'll see the word uses in very tiny writing. Hold on, maybe I can zoom in. Nope, I can. There we go. Look at that. So you'll see uses at the very top. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I was trying to quiet my kids down. I don't know if you heard that. So anyway, you see uses here, and then you'll see sources down here. And as we go over, all I'm doing is I'm stretching them out over time. So if this is my year zero, meaning that this is the year that I close, this is the due diligence, this is the acquisition, this is the historic tax credit fees that I pay up front. This is typically because you pay an architect a significant amount of money before you close on the project because you need your building permit. And then ultimately, developer fee, I just throw back in the mix in the very beginning. So this is the amount of money I'm spending at closing. And then I take my construction and I spread it out over 12 months. See, this is just a straight line analysis of my 1.3 million bucks. I'm saying that I spend it equally for 12 months. And to get into the technicals, usually the construction spend resembles a bell curve. It's actually a skewed bell curve in terms of the life cycle of a project, but it's actually more conservative to just do a straight 12-month straight line. It actually makes you a little more on the conservative end and trying to actually show that bell curve project spend. If you're getting into really expensive projects, the bell curve is important. It costs millions of bucks. In your project, it's probably just best likely to say, hey, look, if this is the construction contract and I think it's going to take 9 months to build, then I'm just going to straight line it across 9 months. So that's all this is you're taking your uses and you're stretching it out over time. I stretch it out over 12 months. Then you take your sources and you do the same thing, except you start with the sources that need to go into the project first, meaning that your 622 of equity, which is, the first thing that I showed you, that has to be spent first. Then your deferred equity is spent next. And then lastly, your DDD project that is netted out is shown next. So those are spent first before you start drawing down that loan. Then you have your net DDD project. The DDD spans these 2 months. And then here's your net tax credit proceeds. And then only when you're ready and you've exhausted those first things, do you start drawing down your loan right here. And then ultimately that drops down here and you start calculating the interest on that bank draw. So this is a long way of showing you that the interest reserve is complex to calculate. Oftentimes the bank will give it to you, as in they'll do their own calculus. But if you really want to understand how an interest reserve is sized, they are saying to themselves, okay, it's going to take you 12 months to build and 12 months to build. And we're going to give the project owner 12 months of interest built into their budget, because just because you're under construction, the bank doesn't care. They want to get paid anyway. So as you pull their money out of the bank and into your project, they're going to want to charge you interest on it. And the interest reserve is something that pays that until the project can pay it itself. And as you can see here, in my project, I run out of interest reserve around year 19, in which time my interest goes from funded, which is funded in interest reserve, to unfunded, meaning that I start paying that money out of the project myself. This is just showing the same thing: sources, uses, and time. Just adding those all up, and sorry. There's a funny little picture. So that's what that was. And then here I put a picture of training wheels to show you that that is what an interest reserve is. It is training wheels on your project. It gives you a little runway to complete your project, lease it up. That's important because you're not going to just automatically lease it up as soon as you're finished. Let's say it takes you 12 months to build, and then you assume that you're going to lease it up over 6 months. And those training wheels better be big enough to get you from 12 months plus 6 months to 18 months total. And of course, if you want 2 years of interest reserve, even though you only need one, and you're that weird kid who's too old for training wheels on your bike, and it creates all sort of issues for you down the road, meaning that you're borrowing too much money just to pay it back on itself, and you end up losing in that scenario. So try to size your interest reserve. Don't be afraid to take off the training wheels at a certain point. So don't borrow too big of an interest reserve. Don't be that big kid with training wheels. And then this is the last slide, I think, before questions or just for some fun stuff next. Site control was the last thing that we had talked about on the initial slide. So we went over debt, we went over equity, we went over grants, and we went over tax credits and how to calculate your interest reserve, which is what you owe the bank as you're building. Site control is really game time. And when you say site control, what you mean is you actually own that real estate, or you've tied up the real estate with a deposit. And so there's ways that when you focus on getting to site control moments, that you can study the project as best you possibly can before you put any money on the street. If it's a hot asset and you really have to get it tied up, then go ahead. Send in an offer, send in your deposit, hope they accept it and all that good stuff. But if it's something that's been sitting on the market for several months or several years, you don't necessarily have to go out and send out a purchase and sale agreement right away. You can go ahead and take your time studying it. There's good county records out there. There's a great tool called Parcel Search. If you look up Newcastle County Parcel Search, it's a wonderful tool, the best I've ever seen actually in any sort of market. The county has wonderful records on every property that can be useful in underwriting your stuff. And then lastly, of course, if it is on the market with a broker, you can contact the broker and get their materials, and you can use those two things to triangulate kind of your project information and do all the analysis that you can do with those materials. Google Earth, also very helpful in terms of measuring the square footage of your building. I use Google Earth all the time to measure a building. Offer and deposit, I just said that. So basically the deposit money is money that you put up in earnest, meaning that, if you don't want the project after you put up that check, usually it's defined in the purchase and sale agreement, 30, 60, 90 days. After that 30, 60, 90 days, if you don't ask for your money back and you want to proceed, it's called hard money, or it's called going hard in the industry, meaning that you can't get your deposit back after that point. So you're either going to buy the building or you're going to be out that deposit. And so these are the things that you can work with when you're trying to get a project under control. And then, of course, there's also contingencies that are in an offer. If you're submitting an offer that has a financing contingency, what that means is you're telling the seller of the property, hey, I want to buy this subject to me being able to get a loan to buy it, right? So if you don't end up getting the loan to buy it, you can back out. And that's wonderful if you're buying a property that is, not exactly sought after, but naturally, if somebody else submits an offer for that property and it doesn't have a financing contingency, that person would probably win the bid or get it under contract over you. But as someone who can't buy real estate without a loan, I often like financing contingencies just in case I can't actually secure the loan. I don't have to buy the property. And then congratulations, at that point, all the fun really begins. So we've just talked about sourcing and using a project before you actually close on it, estimating how much money you can get from all these various sources, and saying to yourself that this project makes sense. And then, of course, once you actually close and you're trusting that sources and uses, the real fun begins, because now you get to do the demo, clean the asbestos, do the construction, see if the market wants what you're putting out on the street, all that fun stuff. I had a couple of slides, I think, just for fun. This is showing you this is from the Midtown project, the apartment building that's in downtown Wilmington. This is just one of the loans. There are several loans to build that $75 million project. And this is just for one of the loans. So as you can see, as you get more complex, your sources and uses can get very, very complex. In this loan itself, you had to have, if you look over here, you had to have initial operating deficit and a working capital reserve. They looked over here and they said, oh, well, this is the maximum amount of mortgageable proceeds. Here is the amount of non-mortgageable proceeds. It just gets really, really in depth how, in this case, it was HUD who was the one who was doing the loan. It was Housing and Urban Development. So I just wanted to show you that your sources and uses can get very, very complex as you go on to build stuff. But at the end of the day, when you look at these funny pictures of, uplifting developers with hard hats on, what are they looking at? They're looking at the sources and uses. And the sources and uses ultimately equals this large building, because that's those stacks, those ledgers that you have. This project had its sources and uses, and there was a little analyst like me staying on that thing every single day, making sure that the numbers were coming in. But it all started with the sources and uses for the project. So with that said, I think that's where I'm done with my spiel, and I'd be happy to take questions. And I'm sorry I didn't leave much time for questions, but I can stay for as long as need be, as long as you can hear me with those damn kids in the background.
Rob, there was one question from way back in the beginning of the presentation. I apologize in advance if you already answered it, but it was from Sarah Lester. Is $95,000 a low developer's fee?
Yep. Okay.
And is there a percentage that you aim for with the developer's fee?
This is a very good question. So typically when you're calculating a developer fee, what you want to do is you want to take out the things that the developer doesn't touch. Specifically, usually that means acquisition. So you're going to want to take out, if you take the bottom line of the 2.5 and you subtract out, of course, the developer fee, because you're not going to take a fee on your fee. And then you subtract out the acquisition cost of the building, meaning that, this is just what the seller sets the property at. The developer doesn't really, and usually the acquisition cost is a big one. So you don't want to count the cost of the property towards the developer fee. You want to basically put a percentage on the things that the developer actually touches, which is due diligence, submitting the tax credits, overseeing the construction, overseeing the architect's design. All this stuff is usually pretty good stuff that the developer has to do with. They don't necessarily set the acquisition price, so you usually strip that out. Once you do that and you strip out the things that the developer does not touch or traditionally doesn't touch, then usually developer fee starts at around 4%, and then it can go up as high as 11% if and only if it's a super crazy complex project like a tax credit project. So who gave me the 11% number? Was it a private market person investor? No private market person investor would typically allow an 11% developer fee. You know who came up with that? An appraiser saying, yeah, I think based on the market comps and based on how complex this deal is, meaning how crazy hard you're going to be working to do a tax credit project, you deserve a fee of this. And because that appraiser said that, then you usually want to triangulate somewhere in the middle. But 4% is a typical fee that I see a private sector person actually accepting to pay a developer.
Are there any other questions?
Just a little bit.
Yeah, just like a lot of it. I would close it up. So when you pushed it in like that, you were out there.
Theodore? Oh, okay, I thought there was a question. Are there any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and present your question, or you can put your question in the chat. Okay. Well, with that, it sounds like there aren't any additional questions. So we'd like to conclude this evening's Kickstart session. Fantastic presentation, Rob. I put in the chat on behalf of Cinnaire, and as a lender, we see these sources come through in a project all the time. So it's really important to understand these sources, how to use them, how they come into a project to support the advancement of development. So continue to do your research. These are all local sources that were cited. I saw a couple of questions in the chat about the presentation. So yes, you will receive a copy of the recording and a follow-up email that should come out either tomorrow or Wednesday. So with that being said, I just want to thank you again, Rob, for your time and for sharing your talent. Not everyone is willing to actually share information about their project, their sources and uses, all of the information you shared this evening. So thank you. It was greatly appreciated. We would like to say that everyone, thank you. Thank you everyone else for joining us. In that follow-up email, there will also be a link to a survey. So we would greatly appreciate your feedback and also insight on future development topics that you would like to see as part of the Kickstart sessions. We will be having an April Kickstart session, so be on the lookout for an invitation to that in the next few weeks. Again, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you at a future Jumpstart event. Have a good evening.
Hey, Deanna. Quick question before you go. I tried to ask Robin a private message, but he had disconnected. While we didn't have questions now, should there be questions that we have later on down the road, is there a way in which I may be able to reach out to Rob, whether through his office, email, social media, phone, whatever, smoke signal? Is there any options available?
Let me follow up with him and just make sure it's okay for us to release his contact information. I will send him an email this evening, and if he says that's okay, we'll also include that in a follow-up email.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I didn't want to cut you when you were talking. I was like,
no, it's okay.
No,
it's okay. You could have completely cut me off or put something in the chat.
I'll work on not being. I appreciate you though. Thank you.
But I'll definitely, and I think you're definitely on our distribution list. So
yeah, I'm part
if
of
the answer, yes, I recognize your name. So if the answer is no, I'll just send you an email privately to say, unfortunately, I can't release this information. But if he says yes, then we'll include it in the thank you email that goes out within the next day or two.
All right, thank you so much. Be safe, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye.